I am Delia Valles from New Mexico State University, and I am with the NSF HSI STEM Resource Hub, and I co-host this webinar series along with Dr. Marta Desmond. I would like to welcome you to our second webinar of our spring webinar series, targeting grantmanship and preparing for the NSF HSI call due in September. Today's topic is evaluation as a strength of your grant proposal. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This webinar will last 1 hour. Today's webinar has one speaker, and we anticipate from 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. All questions related to the topic must be submitted via Q&A chat or box. However, if you have a question related to Zoom or technical issues, please put them in the chat box. So the QA is for questions and the chat box is for technical issues. We will have an individual dedicated to monitor the technical questions, and we have also an individual in Twitter managing comments about the webinar. There is also a team consisting of Dr. Marta Desmond, Dr. Margie Vela, our program manager, and myself, curating questions and reading them at the end of the presentation. We might not have enough time for to answer all of the questions, but we will address them and post all of the answers to your questions in our portal. Webinars are also being recorded, and the recordings and materials will be available in our portal. All of these materials can be accessed through the portal, and the website for the portal will be actually posted in the chatting room in a little bit for you to join us. There's no charge for actually the membership for joining us. At the end of the presentation, you should also receive an email with a very short survey monkey from Mr. David Leach. Please take a few minutes to complete it. And I know that some of you have completed before. However, we really need your feedback and data to report it to NSF to measure our program outcomes. As an added incentive, when you complete the survey, your name will be entered in a drawing for a $15 Amazon gift card. The winner will receive a gift card electronically within 2 weeks. And also the winner from the last webinar we had in March, the 5th, his name is Joel Thompson from Harnell College in Salinas, California. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon. It's Dr. Rachel Boren, and she's currently the director of the NMSU Southwest Outreach Academic Research. She's an evaluation and policy center. Dr. Boren earned her PhD in Educational Research, Statistics, and Evaluation from the University of Virginia, where she was trained in program evaluation and research methods in education and the social sciences. She has a diverse portfolio of training and experience with program evaluation and research education and healthcare. The most recently work that she's done is an evaluation for the provost office at the University of Texas at El Paso. She has been also the director of evaluation for a $70 million National Institute of Health funded center based at the University of Washington. She also serves as the evaluator for several grants at NMSU, including one of mine, and also for various organizations across the state. And also she does it also with the support of her SOAR team. Dr. Boren, we will have an indication for you that there's 5 and there's 1 minute left for your presentation. And welcome, Dr. Boren, this afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. What a nice intro. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just make sure we're all set up here. Okay, just get to the top. Just practicing this earlier. Okay, So can everyone see the nice big intro slide? Are we good?
Yes, we see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's very nice to be here. I was going to say all the things that Dr. Valles just said about my background, but she summed it up very well. So it's great to be here, and we've got a very fun agenda that I'm very excited to get to today. And so first, just a little about SOAR and who we are. We're in the College of Education at NMSU. We were formed there about 5 years ago, and we serve as evaluators for grants across campus, different departments. We've got different funding agencies right now that we're working with. And then we work with external groups like nonprofits, K-12, other colleges and universities all over the place. And our areas are mostly education, but we do workforce evaluation, healthcare, social sciences, lots of stuff. We can do all sorts of things. We write eval plans for proposals, then facilitate the evaluation if it's funded, which includes all sorts of components like helping with the IRB, human subjects research, data collection and analysis, both qualitative and quantitative. We can do nice technical summaries for you or your funder. And so please email me if you'd like to talk with us about working with SOAR. My contact info will be at the end of the slides. And then just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to touch on the evaluation component in the narrative and the RFA. It may be called a couple of different things depending on the actual funding opportunity itself, but we're going to talk about that section in general. And then fundamentals of program evaluation. It's really not just about measuring impact, but key is also facilitating continuous improvement during your grant. So you're regularly making changes as needed to achieve your goals, as funders really more and more want to see that you're using your data and what your impact is. And then keeping it realistic. Making sure your evaluation timeline and goals are feasible. Don't make it too complicated, too much. And then things to consider when you're identifying your outcomes and what you'd like to track. And then we're going to end with logic models, an often requested component of the proposal that can convey a ton of key information about your entire project. And it's so worth taking the time to really complete a logic model very well. These can really strengthen your proposal or hurt it if it's just really, really confusing and not helpful for anything. And then I'll also mention we're going to go in depth with these concepts, among others, at the hands-on workshops in May and June that the STEM Hub is hosting, which I'll plug again at the end of today. And then we'll end with Q&A. And so I did first, just for one slide, I wanted to talk a little about evaluation in the grant itself to really set us up for the rest of today's topics, and because I think this is really important. And so your evaluator, I think, should write the evaluation or assessment section in your narrative per the RFA, but it should fit into the rest of your application very seamlessly. And you'll want to make sure it does when you review the entire document. So keep in mind, I think this is important, that we, the evaluators, will use the verbiage in the RFA for writing the evaluation section, as different agencies want different components mentioned, different things mentioned and described in the evaluation section, like the rest of your proposal is tailored to the RFA. So the eval section is no different. It should be tailored to whatever the RFA or the FOA or the funding opportunity announcement says. So for instance, if your RFA says we expect to see this in your eval plan, then the evaluation section should address that. And that likely means that we're going to expect to see that you're going to talk about certain areas and have certain topics and goals that fit into the RFA. So we're going to talk about how we're going to measure that. And so here's just a couple of examples from two very different funding agencies and proposals I'm working on. I've got notes on this side as well, 2 screens. And I just wanted to mention those here. And we made sure that these were addressed in the evaluation section in the narrative. And so you can see one of them is NSF, and it says describe how increases in diversity research and education outputs will be evaluated internally or externally. And then one is from the USDA, and it says identify data to be used as baseline data, keyword, and then demonstrate that the project's impact on improving education will be evaluated. And so As you look at the evaluation section when you write your grant, you should have the constructs and areas that they talk about in the RFA included here, like increases in diversity research, education, or baseline data. Best to make sure that you have baseline data somewhere that you refer to. And then I think this is important as well. As you craft your entire narrative, it's important to remember that evaluation is also not just a standalone siloed component in your application. This section fits into your larger narrative and has components that are found elsewhere. So for instance, anytime you mention constructs or outcomes you want to impact or activities or how you will achieve those things, outcomes, activities, are going to be mentioned all over the place in your narrative. And you want to make sure that you're consistent with the language that you use throughout your application and your evaluation section too. You don't want to have the eval section talking about assessing attitudes about science if your focus is on something like financial wellness, or talk about evaluating a summer boot camp if you're doing Saturday workshops. And those might be a bit extreme, but you get the point. You want to make sure that you're consistent throughout the whole thing. And then also, I think it's important in your RFA or in your narrative, when you're talking about your management plan, your evaluator shouldn't be overly worked into the leadership or core inner workings of what you're doing, as it doesn't make us look objective. It makes us look too involved, unless the RFA for some reason says, we want your evaluator to be part of the core team. Okay, then that's what you'll do. But you do also want to mention how you'll meet with the evaluator during your grant. So even if we're not part of the core leadership team, you want to mention how you'll meet with us, how do we fit into your group and structure, how you'll talk with us about the data, all of that. So we should still be part of what you're doing, just probably not too worked in. And then evaluation, the last couple of pieces, is important with the timeline. So you don't need like nitty gritty eval tasks in your timeline, but you do want to show that you're making evaluation a key part of your activities and what you're doing throughout the grant. So it's clear you've really thought about it and you're integrating these important tasks in what you're doing. So maybe like collecting pre-post data or debrief data at the end of the year. That's nice to show in a timeline. Those are usually pretty big deals. And it's good for the timeline to show that you'll meet to discuss findings and review data and identify changes with the evaluator, as that's also an important part of your evaluation as well, that you're using data to inform improvement and change and identify what's working. It's not just about what do we need to fix. It's also what's going well that we need to retain. And then just a couple of things about the purposes of evaluation and the main pieces. So first, evaluation is about impact, right? It's really about what are the results of all your proposed activities, your work, what changes will occur if you reach your grant goals. And I think that when you're outlining your targeted impact for a grant, you want to keep it very simple. And I think this is useful to first think about your population, right? So who is it that you want to impact? Are these teachers, students, and even then, is it a subset? So is it maybe first generation college students, engineering majors, both? You know, I think kind of doing this sort of funneled, who is it? And then is there a specific subset, is a nice way to identify who you want to impact. And then outline what you want to impact. And again, trying not to overcomplicate it. Are these attitudes like self-efficacy in math? More academic like retention or GPA? All of these are great, totally valid, just keep it focused. And then these are just two examples from funded projects that we're on that, again, are pretty different. The first one is an NSF grant with Dr. Dawood at NMSU. And this is one of a few objectives. So if you see it, you can see that the group are DACC, so Indiana Community College, engineering students who come to NMSU. And it's really retention and completion that are the targeted outcomes. And then the second one is from the New Mexico Public Education Department, and teachers are the population of interest there. In particular, this grant was for much smaller districts. We've got lots of very small ones all over the state. And the area of focus was really helping teachers to use more research-based instructional approaches in math. And so these are different, but still both focused and important and relevant to the funding agency. And when you convey these in your grant, you want to make sure that your outcomes and your populations are clear and exciting for the funder, and that they match the funding opportunity. And then the other huge piece of evaluation is formative evaluation, or using data throughout your grant to regularly improve what you're doing, and again, to retain what is working. And so I would think about the kind of formative continuous improvement as, answering what you need to know to determine to make any changes, to determine if you need to make changes so that you can make sure you're on track to achieving your goals and outcomes. That's what really should guide your eval. What do we need to fix, or what do we need to retain so we can achieve these goals? And this is so important to integrate into grants, because funders care about impact, but you'll see continuous improvement often mentioned in the RFAs as well. And you don't want to come to the end of year 3 or year 5 without any examples of how you use data to improve your program. That's not good. And we often use surveys, focus groups, interviews to get this kind of stakeholder feedback. That's so helpful with identifying what's working well and what's not. And this also isn't necessarily just participants of your grant, like the engineering students at DACC or the teachers, but also members of the grant team, especially those who are integral with implementing your program and planning the program, and others who have a stake in the program's success. So that could also be administrators or leadership in your college or unit or organization. And the questions you ask each of those different groups and stakeholders may differ a little bit, but there's also going to be overlap about, well, what is your perspective on this impact? What do you think is working? How is this really relevant to the university or the community? And so getting different perspectives is always useful. And then, so you may also interview students and mentors to understand relationships. So that's another example of sort of different perspectives to understand an important area in your grant. And then you can also use other types of data that you're already collecting for your program to improve decisions as well. So for instance, if you don't see that pass rates for certain high failure rate courses are changing across semesters as you'd hope to see, and then maybe you check to see and you find that nobody went to this tutoring program or nobody used tutors because that maybe was part of what your program implemented. Maybe tutors, because we've been involved in that. Tutors to help pass rates in these sort of large lecture, high failure rate classes. You look at the attendance and you see no one's going. Well, that's not good. But that can only tell you so much. So if you notice something like that, it would be really helpful to then follow up and talk to students or faculty or the tutoring coordinator to get a sense of what they think can change. Why are people not going? Was tutoring advertised enough? Were the hours inconvenient? All that information, contextual info, is so important that a lot of it you can really only get by talking to people. And then I think all of this is important, but I think that some of these are just also some really nice tips that I think are helpful for PIs, anyone working on any part of a grant. And I think bullet 1, I know sometimes grants are last minute and it can be a rushed process. I totally get it. But ideally, it's always helpful to involve your evaluator early in the process to help advise on your metrics, outcomes, and all the stuff that we're talking about today to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And I always tell my PIs or directors or managers or whoever I work with that you all are the content experts who know your grant area. And this should really be a partnership between my knowledge of methods and your knowledge of your population, activities, approach. So really, we should be working together to make sure that you have a strong evaluation. And I think one way to keep it simple and feasible is to integrate data collection into your activities where possible, as this saves time and it doesn't make eval look like it's something extra, that's some totally different afterthought or some other component that you really thought about last minute. It's all integrated. And there are a couple ways to do that. I use this a lot with grants or with other programs that we're evaluating that may not be part of a grant, but it's still just something going on that we're assessing. One is that maybe you reserve time at the end of a scheduled event, like a cohort meeting or a longer workshop or anything where a lot of people are going to be, and it's possibly a required component or an event for people or participants. And then maybe those last 30 minutes of a meeting that was already going to exist, are for a focus group or a survey that's meant to gather feedback about the experience. So that's a good way to get some rich, detailed information and leverage something that's already happening. And we do this a lot, even online now with Zoom activities. We treat them like they're in person. We'll come to an event and then maybe for the last half hour or at lunch or whatever, we'll do Zoom focus groups or pop a survey link in the chat. Of course, after agreeing with the PI on the plan, and then we collect any data, or when we do collect data, we ask program staff to step out if it's with, students or participants, so that people can feel more freedom to be honest about what they like, what they don't like. And we do the same thing if it's in Zoom, make one of us the host and, you can leave and then we'll talk and take over from here. So I would think about if you have opportunities for this approach in what you're proposing, because this is also an easy way to help with the evaluation. And it's nice to know that your evaluation is feasible when we're mapping it all out. And then I think another way to integrate data collection is if you have regular workshops or events as part of a program or a course students take, like a lot of NIH programs that I worked with back in Seattle or here at NMSU with NIH training grants. And you want a little feedback about the workshop like this, or facilitators throughout the semester. I think the instructor can go ahead and pop a quick link into the chat or hand out an anonymous half sheet form after the workshop is done, while everyone is still present, either online or in a room. And I think for this, it's easy just to have a course instructor or coordinator put a link in the chat. Because we, the evaluators, don't need to be at every single data collection, event. I don't necessarily need to jump in at the end of every single class for these quick forms that may take 5 minutes to fill out that are super specific, because the instructor can't see the results. They're just there to make sure students have the link, but then I'm the only one, or me and maybe one of my doctoral students can see the results. And I think giving the survey when everyone is there is great for two reasons. One, memory is fresh. And two, and very importantly, I think giving people, students, anyone, a 3 to 5 minute survey that has room for open-ended feedback about what you liked, what you didn't like, seems really quick once a week. But we also give comprehensive, mid-year check-ins or end-of-year check-in evaluation surveys. And so I could ask about those speakers at the end of the semester on those surveys, but space on those surveys at the end, those comprehensive mid-year or end of semester surveys is very precious. And I don't want to put anything on there that we can't ask elsewhere. So 5 speaker evaluations that may just take 10 to 15 minutes total to evaluate may not seem like a lot, but couple that with a more comprehensive, beefy, highly reflective end of semester or end of year survey, and it's a lot. And so I think looking for opportunities to gather feedback throughout your activities is great. And then one more note too. I think in terms of activities, the last piece about the timelines, what you plan, really dig into your timeline that you put into your proposal, or even you may have one for your proposal and then a super detailed separate one that doesn't go into the proposal, but is external for planning purposes, would be realistic and optimistic about what you can do. So a nice mix, which I know is hard to do sometimes. And I think in terms of being realistic and optimistic, I would watch for things like if you're relying on partnerships or folks outside of your department, your college, your institution, there are layers to everything and considerations with all of that. And I think that, part of evaluation and what we look at in grants is if you're adhering to your timeline, that's part of the evaluation. Did you accomplish what you planned in a given time? If not, then why? Because that's fine. Things don't always go perfect as planned, but your timeline is an important part of your narrative and evaluation and really part of conveying the impact that you want. And so I think I would spend plenty of time on timelines, which we'll talk about in the hands-on workshop, and really acknowledge what's involved in each step. So where you may have places that are sequential, with one activity that cannot happen without another task being completed first. So really, if there has to be this one thing that can happen before anything else can go on versus, concurrent activities where you can have things going on and accomplish multiple things at once. I think it's important to watch for that. And then I love pilots. I think pilots are your friend. Integrating a pilot into your timeline is great. As an evaluator, it helps us test instruments as needed, helps identify problems nice and early before you decide to scale up. So I think pilots are a sometimes overlooked, super useful tool that can do so much good for your entire project. And then to my second note, and then we'll get to logic models. I love tables. I think keeping your thoughts organized is always helpful. This is just a standard table that I use in evaluations for grants. I think it's helpful to align your metrics or outcomes with your goals or objectives, especially if you have lots of different goals like this particular grant did is with Dr. Dowd that I mentioned earlier. Because I think that, if you have all these different outcomes, constructs, goals, a table can help keep it organized to link an outcome and a data source and when it's collected. Not too nitty gritty, but at least an idea of when you're going to collect this and to make sure that you can collect it. And I think that it's important to be able to articulate these things in a proposal, and this table or something like this is just a nice way to do it. And so you also are going to use this kind of table and this kind of planning to determine if any of this is actually feasible. So you may want to collect graduation rates, for instance, that can get pulled from Banner or Cognos or whatever student system you use. Awesome. And you want to check if your participants maybe graduated each semester after they transfer to New Mexico State University. Totally fine. You may also have survey data that you want to collect from participants, like to measure changes in teacher resilience or grit. And then thinking too about how often you want to measure something and collect it. So things like that, resilience or grit, may not be helpful to look at every single semester. We may not see that much change. And knowing your activities, you may have a lot going on and you think, no, that really we want to look at on a yearly basis to see the change. And then different types of data, I think this is so important, also mean very different workloads, right? And so Banner data about did students graduate, yes or no? This is not very time consuming to go in, pull, do some analyses. Sometimes it's already updated on college websites on a regular basis. Survey data now means that someone has to take the time to create the survey, give the survey, analyze the data, and then summarize it. And so it's important to really think what's involved with this data collection. And is it feasible? And do we have the people we need? All of that. And then I think on that final one too, the near peer mentoring. So process-based data is also great, I think, to include in a data table. So this particular grant has a near peer mentoring component for students. And we want to know how that's going for the students and the mentors. So we'll look at stuff like, well, how often did these pairs meet? Get a little feedback survey from both of them, maybe do some focus groups at the end of the year. So this keeps it feasible and gives us lots of opportunities for feedback. And then I think too, I want to note, it's important to think early on if your outcomes are feasible to collect in general and feasible to collect when you need the data. So there's lots of public data, for instance, available about all sorts of stuff like education, health, population characteristics, social behavior. But there can be huge lags between when that data is collected and when you actually can see it. And so it's possible your most recent data now may not be, or, maybe from 2018 or 2019, but you need something much more fresh. And so you also may be asking for testing data or graduation data that may not be confirmed until later on after the semester is done. Thinking too about things like you want to collect administrator data, maybe get an interview with them. Are they really going to have the time to talk to you for 3 hours every semester? It's just important to think about that as you're creating your plan. And this is also the case if you're working with K-12, because you're really at their mercy. And what they will allow you to do. Would not assume that you can implement a study that will take up instructional time exactly as you may want. But I think this is where compromise comes in. So you may not be able to get feedback as often as you want or exactly as you want, but there's opportunities, I think, to work with others to still make a plan that gets you good data. And then I also think that just the last piece too, thinking about if you really need to survey folks or ask for information, or if you can get this data in other ways. And so I think this is part of the, is it feasible? Like student records or databases or other means to save yourself logistical trouble and time with collecting this and then spending extra time having to make sure that everybody answers every question on every survey. And so what I mean is that you can ask students if they've received an NIH award in a follow-up survey, or you can, look at NIH Reporter or a database, or look at student retention if you're interested in enrollment to see if they're still enrolled. So you may not need to follow up with the student to ask, are you still enrolled at your home institution, if you can get access to that information from Banner or Cognos. So you just really want to make sure that surveys really include things that you need to ask and that you can't get in another way. And then finally, logic models are awesome. These are a super important component of an evaluation. And in my opinion, everything. I think logic models can convey so much. And these will help you think about what you're proposing now, maybe future programs for grants that you're proposing. But what is a logic model? So, tools for planning, describing, managing, communicating, and evaluating a program or intervention. And so they graphically represent the relationships between your program activities and intended effects, and how each part of the model flows with arrows that show how one piece leads to the next. And if we have the situation, then we need these resources to fix it. We'll use these resources to do these activities, and you'll see these outcomes from doing these activities. And I think logic models also show the assumptions that you have about your program and the context in which your program operates. And I think those are important and often overlooked unless you really have to sit down and think about them. And I think the whole logic model is a good way to really think about just this nice general broad strokes. What is it that we're doing? Is it feasible? And does it make sense? And then we'll go over a couple in a minute. And so this is a nice beefy one, right? This is the logic model for the entire Institute of Translational Health Sciences, the big $70 million NIH grant that was mentioned as part of a background, where I was the director of eval before coming here. And just whammy, so anytime you see that means Washington, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, Idaho. Clever, right? And you can convey a ton of critical information about your program and how every component is connected in one nice picture. We'll break this down in just a sec, but really the left side of the model is really processes, resources, and the right side are your outcomes. So the intended effects, both short and long term. And then the arrows are really sort of this critical assumption that make the flow of if then. If we have this, then we see this. Very important to have your arrows in a logic model. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but the mission at the top should really guide everything. So your grant may have this huge overarching goal. Your program may have a mission that should be at the very top, and everything under it should be related. And so our mission was to speed up the scientific discovery process of, I wonder if this drug or this device can help with this particular condition, because that usually takes like 10 to 15 years. And it's an incredibly long process. So we had a lot of stuff to fix it because it's a very complex process to fix that kind of problem. And so first, the left side has sort of the processes and nuts and bolts and pieces of your program. And so the situation, you may not always see this in a logic model. I like it. It's an important part that should be in anything that you make. What problem are you addressing? So it could be something as complicated as the scientific discovery process that we worked on that's incredibly broad, or it could be super focused, like that there is low participation in research, which is a little more specific. And then inputs are next. So you have this problem. What resources did you gather to fix it? So this isn't just money, but any resource, such as people, time, facilities, anything. You can see it was partners, sites, facilities, everything. So inputs are not just money. And then activities are what you're going to do with these inputs to address the situation, to see the outcomes that you want. And so for us, we had lots of different professional development sessions. We had study startup help. And these can be small, like trainings that we offered that varied from 1 hour small PD or professional development sessions to multi-week-long boot camps designed to help folks work together better on interdisciplinary teams. And then remember these nice key arrows there at the top that really convey the if-then. So if we have a complicated scientific discovery process, and if we use our funds, partner sites, and ITHS to provide trainings, support researchers, engage communities, then we'll see the outputs and outcomes that we're going to see on the next page. And then the right side of the logic model really has the results that you want to see. So both immediate and countable, and then longer term impact. And I would think of outputs as just more direct, easily quantifiable, tangible products of the activities that are useful for monitoring and often reported to your funding agency, and sometimes in very, very specific tables. And these are what we get from our activities. So for us, Scholars was one of our outputs because we had a postdoctoral program, teams that we put together. We also funded pilot awards for investigators, et cetera. And so these are easy to count to show progress toward your goal, and they should be directly related to your outcomes and a useful measure of impact. And then outcomes are really the results that we want to see from our program. This is the kicker. These include short-term and long-term, or you can also add intermediate, if you want to break down your timeline even more. It may depend on how long your grant is and if it makes sense, or what it is that you're measuring and how much detail you really want to go into. And so short-term are really the more immediate effects. So for us, it was things like higher use of our services. We wanted to see a continuous increase in utilization of all the cool stuff that the ITHS offered. Maybe local implementation of best practices. So you may have, longer term dissemination, broad use of best practices, great, but maybe you want to start with local implementation, which is probably much easier to track. And then long term are the results of your study or of your grant that can take a while and are more about the strong impact that really addresses your situation. Like the population will receive health discoveries faster. That's a big one. The entire research process will be easier for researchers to navigate and quicker to complete. Those are non-trivial. And so those are a bit longer term and involve, attaining our short term to get to our long term. And so if we look again at the if-then flow, we were on activities in the last slide. And so if we do activities like trainings, supporting researchers, engaging communities, then we'll produce scholars, research teams, participants, teams, awards. And in the short term, we hope to see an increase in ITHS utilization, an increase in research participation, which was a huge issue, and in the and an improved study startup process. And then after all this is going well, we maybe scale up a little, people talk to each other, we reach out, we'll see that the population receives health discoveries faster, the overall health of the WWAMI region is improved, et cetera. So everything should really make sense from the start in your situation all the way to the end. And then I think too, I'll mention this, the connection from activities, which is right before outputs, connection between activities and outputs to outcomes is so important. Make sure it makes sense to expect your results given what you're doing for your program and for your grant applications. And so if you have a complex problem like the study startup process is really difficult, that's going to take a lot of different activities to fix. And so you really want to take a look at everything that you're doing when you make your logic model, really take the time. And we will at the workshop I'll be doing in May and June. And then I also want to revisit it just one last time and then plug the workshops, and then we're good. Now that we've sort of seen it all, I want to look at the bottom pieces. So the context and assumptions are an important part of your model that are on the bottom. And just to quickly touch on those, your assumptions are an important part of your model. They show core beliefs about your program. Sometimes they seem obvious, but it's still good to work these out, put them in, and actually articulate them. I think that it's very important to do that, even if they seem obvious. So for our institute, we had assumptions like Training investigators in translational science will actually improve the efficiency, so how fast the scientific discovery process happens. So really, we assume that what we were doing would lead to the results that we wanted, and very important. Context is also key, as every situation, every program is different, and your context impacts what you'll do and what you want to see, and you have no control over it. I think that's important too. So for us, context was the WWAMI region, which was super broad, and that was just meant to sort of encompass everything different that you could find to be different about the WWAMI, so the Upper Pacific Northwest area, compared to places like Madison, Wisconsin, or Vanderbilt University, which also had translational centers just like ours, funded by the NIH. But, you know, there's lots of things that are different about different parts or different universities, different settings, states, regions, everything. And then the U, as we call it, the University of Washington, and any university is its own context as well. And then two things like the national landscape of NIH funding and funding priorities is also context. They can decide to focus on something else and not to fund any particular area anymore. Very important, relevant for you, no control over it. And so now that we've gone through all these pieces, let's just have another quick look at the sort of overall model, now that you know about all these nice different components. And so, and I'm just looking here too. And so, right, we have this situation all the way on the left. So the scientific discovery process is complicated, research participation is low. Well, we're going to fix that by putting these inputs in: funding, time, subject matter experts, communities, technology, a lot of different technical pieces and interventions that we had and ways of reaching out. And then we're going to take all that stuff that we're putting in and do these different activities. So we're going to use the funding, the partners, the tech to provide training, support researchers. Recruitment was huge, engage communities, all these different things. And then after we do all of that, or as we do it, we expect to see some nice quantifiable results from this work. We're going to see scholars that we supported, research participants that we recruited, teams that we created, new programs like our pre-postdoctoral program, other boot camps and cool stuff like that. Great. And now also, as we're seeing all of these different outputs that we can easily tally, we hope to see much bigger and more impactful outcomes now that we've got all these teams and scholars and programs. Like, more people will use us. There's more participation in research. The startup process is much easier because, wow, it can be complicated. And then if we attain those over time, we're going to then see much broader, more impactful long-term results, like that the population gets health discoveries faster. Health is improved in the WWAMI region and beyond. And the research process is easier for investigators. And then I'll note too, and then plug the workshops, and then I'll take questions. The arrows on this, sometimes I make them a little more clear than this. This one was particularly jazzy. I think it's helpful to show data monitoring in some way in a logic model, to show that you're using data. So your outcomes and your data that you collect about those, your outputs influence your inputs and your activities as well. Like if you're seeing no one's coming to trainings, then yikes, we need to maybe do something different. And instead of a 1 hour anything, it needs to be a boot camp or something like that. And then your assumptions and context also have those bidirectional arrows, because everything influences everything. You're influenced by your context, and you try to, you know, also influence what you can. But I think that assumptions too are key. Everything has a relationship. There shouldn't be any part of your model that's just kind of sitting out there, not connected to everything. And then I'll just plug this as well. And these are in May and June. We're going to go over all of this in more detail and spend some more time working on the areas I talked about today, like drafting outcomes, data collection plans, putting together a logic model, you know, looking and making sure that your components align with what's in your evaluation section. And this will be a great time to really focus on your proposals and dig into these important concepts. And I think we're at 1:44. It was a
Thank
lot.
you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boren, for your great and informative presentation.